Wind howled through the cracked chinking of Hiram's cabin, carrying the scent of incoming snow and sour regret. He had paid 3 ounces of gold for a quiet, biddable bride to knit socks and keep the stove fed. What came off the stagecoach instead was a loud, heavy-hipped woman with a laugh like a busted saloon piano and eyes that stripped him naked. He wanted peace, she wanted everything else, and God help him she was going to get it. Mud sucked at Hiram's boots, a thick, freezing paste that smelled of horse piss and rotten timber. Copper Creek was less a town and more a festering wound on the side of the mountain, a place where desperate men dug for silver and usually just found an early grave. Hiram stood on the boardwalk outside the assay office, his broad shoulders hunched against the biting November wind. His buffalo coat weighed 30 pounds, stinking of old wood smoke and the rancid bear fat he used to waterproof his boots. He liked the smell. It kept people away. The stagecoach was late. Hiram spat a stream of brown tobacco juice into the muddy street, watching it dilute in the freezing rain. He didn't want to be here. He had spent the last 5 years carving a quiet, solitary existence out of the unforgiving granite of the high country. He had his traps, his rifle, and a silence so deep it rang in his ears. But the winters were getting longer. The cold had started to settle into the marrow of his bones, and last February a fever nearly took him. He had lain shivering under a pile of pelts for 6 days, staring at the ceiling, realizing that if he died, the only thing that would mourn him was the raven waiting to pick his eyes out. So he had sent a letter and a leather pouch of gold dust to a matrimonial agency in St. Louis. The instructions were simple, written in his cramped, blocky hand. Want a wife. Quiet. Small. Knows how to work. Don't want no trouble. He expected a mouse. A pale, rail-thin spinster with downcast eyes who would sweep the floors, boil the coffee, and fade into the background like a shadow. The heavy rattle of a thoroughbrace axle cut through the wind. The stagecoach crested the hill, its 6 horses lathered, and blowing steam from their nostrils, their coats slick with freezing rain. The driver cursed, hauling back on the reins, and the heavy wooden coach skidded in the mud before slamming to a halt in front of the station. Hiram didn't move. He watched the driver climb down and yank the door open. 2 drummers got out first, looking green around the gills, clutching bowler hats to their chests. Then the coach rocked on its leather straps. It actually tilted. A booted foot appeared, striking the muddy floorboard with a heavy, deliberate thud. Hiram's jaw tightened. She did not step down so much as she descended, taking up the entirety of the coach's doorframe. She was a mountain of a woman swathed in a cheap, dark green wool travel dress that strained at the seams across her broad back and heavy bust. Her hips were wide, her arms thick, her waist stubbornly refusing to be cinched by whatever corset she had attempted to wrangle herself into. She landed in the mud with a wet splash, ignoring the driver's half-hearted offer of a hand. She stood there, breathing hard, looking around the miserable, rain-soaked street. Her face was round her cheeks, flushed a bright, angry red from the cold. Wisps of dark brown hair had escaped her pinned hat, plastering themselves to her wet forehead. She wasn't delicate. She wasn't a mouse. She looked like a woman who had eaten a mouse for breakfast and was currently looking for a second helping. Jesus wept! Hiram muttered under his breath. He stepped off the boardwalk. His boots squelched in the mud. He stopped a few feet from her, towering over her, though she was tall enough that she didn't have to crane her neck much to meet his gaze. "You Hiram?" she asked. Her voice wasn't a soft, trembling whisper. It was a raspy alto loud enough to cut through the wind and the clatter of the horses. She didn't sound intimidated. She sounded annoyed. "I am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that usually made men step back. She didn't step back. She looked him up and down, her eyes catching on the scars crisscrossing his jaw, the unkempt beard, the sheer, terrifying width of him in the buffalo coat. She didn't flinch. Instead, she let out a short, sharp exhale through her nose. "I'm Josie," she said, crossing her thick arms over her chest. They told me you were a big man. Didn't say you smelled like a dead badger." Hiram blinked. The sheer audacity of the insult hit him like a physical blow. He stared at her, the wheels in his head turning slowly. "Agency said they were sending someone quiet." Josie let out a bark of laughter, a harsh, unpolished sound that made one of the stage horses flick its ears. "The agency says whatever you pay them to say mister. I needed a ticket west and you bought it. Now are we going to stand here in the freezing mud until we both catch our death, or do you have a wagon?" He wanted to put her back on the stage. He wanted to tell the driver there had been a mistake, that he had ordered a delicate prairie flower and got a stubborn mule instead. But the coach was already unloading her single battered leather trunk, tossing it unceremoniously into the muck. And he had paid 3 ounces of gold. Without a word, Hiram walked past her, grabbed the heavy trunk by one handle, and hoisted it onto his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. He jerked his head toward the end of the street. "Wagons this way." He didn't wait for her. He walked fast, expecting her to struggle to keep up in the sucking mud. But he could hear her right behind him, her heavy boots matching his rhythm, her breath whistling slightly through her teeth. The ride up the mountain was an exercise in pure endurance. The wagon seat was narrow, a simple plank of rough pine. Hiram was broad across the shoulders and thick through the thighs. Josie was wide everywhere. There was no way for them to sit without touching. Her heavy wool-clad thigh pressed flush against his corduroy trousers. The cold was brutal, a wet, creeping chill that gnawed at the skin. Hiram ignored it, staring straight ahead at the rumps of his 2 draft horses as they hauled the wagon up the steep, winding trail. He expected her to whine. Women always whined about the cold. She didn't whine. She just shifted her weight, making the wooden seat groan, and reached over, yanking half of the heavy wool blanket off his lap to cover her own knees. Hiram turned his head slowly, glaring at her. Josie met his gaze, her jaw set. Her lips were turning blue, but her dark eyes were furious and unyielding. "You've got a dead animal wrapped around you," she said, her teeth chattering slightly. "I've got cheap cotton underneath this wool. Share or I'll freeze and you'll have wasted your gold." He said nothing. He just turned back to the horses, letting her keep the blanket. For the next 3 hours they rode in silence. But it wasn't the empty, peaceful silence Hiram was used to. It was a loud silence. He could hear the creak of her stays when she breathed. He could smell the damp, musky scent of her unwashed hair, mixed with the sharp tang of cheap rose water she must have dabbed on in St. Louis. He could feel the furnace-like heat radiating off her thick body, seeping through the wet wool and into his own shivering flesh. He hated it. He hated that he was aware of her. He had wanted a ghost. Instead, he had bought a mountain. The cabin sat in a clearing, carved out of a dense stand of lodgepole pines, a brutalist structure of rough-hewn logs and mud chinking. It wasn't built for comfort. It was built to survive. Inside it smelled of stale tobacco-dried blood from last week's butchering and the deep, dusty scent of isolation. Hiram pushed the heavy plank door open and stepped aside. He watched her face, waiting for the disappointment. Women from the city always cried when they saw how men really lived in the high country. Josie stepped inside. She didn't cry. She stopped in the center of the single room, her heavy boots dripping muddy water onto the rough floorboards. She looked at the cast-iron stove in the corner, thick with grease. She looked at the single narrow bed against the wall, piled with furs. She looked at the table littered with gun oil rags and dirty tin plates. "Well," she said, her voice dropping the defensive edge it had in town, "it's got walls." Hiram dumped her trunk at the foot of the bed. It hit the floor with a heavy thud, rattling the coffee pot on the stove. "Bed's yours," he grunted. "I'll take a bedroll on the floor." Josie turned to look at him, her dark eyes narrowing. "You don't have to play the gentleman for me, Hiram. I know what I was bought for." The bluntness of it caught him off guard. A harsh, hot spike of irritation drove into his chest. "I didn't buy a whore." He growled, the gravel in his voice deepening. "I bought a wife, to keep the fire going and the place quiet. You can sleep in the bed." She stared at him for a long moment, reading the tight lines around his eyes, the rigid set of his heavy shoulders. A cynical little smile touched the corner of her mouth. "Suit yourself." Within an hour, the cabin ceased to be his. Hiram was used to moving through his home with an economy of motion, a silent ghost in his own life. Josie did not know how to be silent. She took off her wet dress behind a blanket she had strung up, donning a faded calico wrapper that clung to the heavy curves of her breasts and the deep roll of her stomach. She didn't try to hide her size. She moved with a cumbersome, heavy grace, her bare feet padding loudly against the wood. She found the flour. She found the salt pork. She found the potatoes he had stored in the root cellar. "You use too much wood in this stove," she announced, clanging the iron door shut with a noise that made Hiram flinch. "You're burning it up the flue. Adjust the damper." Hiram sat in the corner, whittling a piece of pine, his jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. "It burns fine." "It burns fast," she corrected, not even looking at him as she hacked at the salt pork with his good skinning knife. "And you need to sharpen this knife. It's duller than a preacher on Sunday." He watched her cook. He was disgusted by the sheer amount of space she occupied. She stood at the counter, her wide hips bumping against the wash basin, her thick arms moving rhythmically as she kneaded biscuit dough. She hummed. It wasn't a pretty tune. It was a tuneless droning sound that vibrated in the small cabin. When she served dinner, she didn't take a meager, polite portion. She piled her tin plate high with pork potatoes and thick, heavy biscuits, drowning it all in milk gravy. She sat at the table opposite him and ate with a ravenous, unapologetic appetite. Hiram picked at his food. He was a big man, 6'4" and heavily muscled, but he ate just to fuel the machine. He watched her mop up the grease on her plate, with a biscuit chewing with her eyes closed in genuine pleasure. It made him deeply uncomfortable. There was an earthiness to her, a raw, fleshy reality that clashed violently with the sterile, frozen world he had built. Night fell, bringing a bitter, howling cold that rattled the single glass window. Hiram unrolled his canvas bedroll on the floor near the stove, leaving his boots on to keep his feet warm. Josie blew out the oil lamp and climbed into the narrow bed. The bed frame shrieked in protest under her weight. Silence descended on the cabin, but it wasn't the silence Hiram craved. It was heavy, suffocating. 10 minutes passed. Then it started. Josie snored. It wasn't a delicate flutter. It was a deep, guttural, rhythmic rattle that seemed to echo off the logs. Hiram lay flat on his back in the dark, staring at the ceiling, his hands balled into fists by his sides. Snuk-shh, snuk-shh. He wanted to scream. He wanted to drag her out into the snow and leave her there. He rolled onto his side, pressing the rough canvas blanket against his ear, but the sound vibrated through the floorboards. Yet, as the hours ticked by, his irritation began to curdle into something else. The cabin was freezing the draft slicing through the floorboards. But every time he opened his eyes and looked toward the bed, he saw the massive, shifting mound of quilts. He could hear the heavy, steady rhythm of her breathing. He could smell the lingering scent of roasting pork and that damn cheap rose water. He was not alone. For 5 years he had laid on this floor or in that bed entirely alone, listening only to the wind trying to tear the roof off. Now there was a loud, heavy breathing entity in the room. A living, radiating furnace of a woman. His body betrayed him. A slow, heavy heat pooled in his gut, a primal reaction to the proximity of soft, warm flesh. He gritted his teeth, angry at his own weakness. She was fat. She was loud. She was everything he didn't want. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force his mind back to the quiet, empty white canvas of the snowdrifts outside. But all he could think about was the way her heavy thigh had pressed against his on the wagon, searing heat right through the wet wool. A week passed in a state of grinding, unspoken warfare. The snow had started falling on Tuesday and hadn't stopped piling 3 feet high against the door, burying the cabin in a suffocating white silence. The physical isolation only amplified the tension inside. They were two large bodies, trapped in a space meant for one. They bumped into each other constantly. Hiram would reach for the coffee pot just as Josie was turning from the stove, her heavy hip colliding with his thigh. She would mutter a sharp curse. He would pull away as if he'd been burned, his jaw tight. He hated how she did things. She chopped wood like a madwoman, swinging his heavy axe with sloppy, dangerous force, her face red, her breath coming in ragged pants. He had stood on the porch watching her attack a log, his hands itching to take the axe from her. "You're gonna break your damn ankle," he had growled, stepping off the porch. "I'm getting it done, ain't I?" She had snapped back, wiping sweat from her forehead with a flour-dusted forearm. She was clumsy. She was loud, but she never quit. That was the thing that ate at him. He couldn't break her. He would purposely leave heavy buckets of water for her to haul from the creek hole, expecting her to leave them. She hauled them. She dragged them into the cabin water, sloshing over her boots, cursing him with every breath. But she did it. The breaking point came on the 8th day. Hiram had brought in a mule deer he'd shot before the storm. The carcass was hanging in the small, freezing lean-to attached to the back of the cabin. It needed skinning and butchering before the meat froze solid. He was working in the dim light of a lantern, his hands slick with blood and silver skin, his breath pluming in the freezing air. His knife slipped on a frozen joint, biting shallowly into the meat of his thumb. He hissed, shaking his hand blood, welling up dark in the dim light. The heavy wooden door to the cabin pushed open. Josie stood there, the warmth of the stove pouring out around her. She was wearing a thick knit shawl over her wrapper. "You've been out here for 2 hours," she said, her raspy voice invading his space. "Dinner is burning." "Leave it then," he snapped, pressing his thumb against his thigh to stem the bleeding. "I got work to do." Josie stepped into the lean-to, pulling the door shut behind her. The small space instantly felt cramped, the air displaced by her physical presence. The lean-to smelled of copper raw meat and cold dirt. She walked over to him, ignoring the hanging carcass. "Let me see," she said. "It's fine. Go back inside." "Don't be a stubborn-ass, Hiram. Let me see it." She didn't wait for permission. She reached out and grabbed his thick, calloused wrist. Hiram froze. Her grip was surprisingly strong. Her hands weren't delicate. They were wide and fleshy, but her palms were warm, unbelievably warm, against his freezing skin. She pulled his hand toward the lantern light, examining the cut. "It ain't deep, but it's dirty." She reached into the pocket of her wrapper, pulled out a somewhat clean rag, and wrapped it tightly around his thumb. She was standing too close. He could smell the sweat on her skin, mixed with the wood smoke from the stove, and that faint, stubborn trace of rose water. He looked down at her. The top of her head barely reached his chin. He could see the dark roots of her hair, the soft, heavy curve of her neck, leading down to the broad expanse of her shoulders. "Why are you so damn difficult?" he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. It wasn't a question about the cut. It was a question about everything. About the loud way she walked, the heavy way she breathed, the way she took up all the air in his cabin. Josie didn't back down. She tied off the rag, then looked up, her dark eyes locking onto his. She didn't let go of his hand. "Because I'm alive, Hiram," she said, her voice raw, stripped of the cynical armor she usually wore. "I ain't a ghost. I ain't a shadow. I take up space. I breathe. I eat. I make noise. If you wanted a dead thing to keep in your cabin, you should have just stuffed that deer and sat it in the corner." Her words hit him in the chest, sharp and painful. He realized with a sudden sickening clarity that she was right. He had wanted a dead thing. He had wanted someone who wouldn't remind him that he was still a man, that he still had blood in his veins that could run hot. He stared at her mouth. Her lips were full, slightly chapped from the cold, pressed together in defiance. A tremor ran through him, not from the cold, but from the violent, conflicting clash of rage and need inside him. He didn't want to want her. He despised her lack of grace. But the heat radiating from her body was a gravitational pull he could no longer fight. "You talk too much," he growled. He didn't give her a chance to respond. He let go of the knife. It clattered to the dirt floor. His large, blood-stained hands came up, grabbing her by the heavy wool of her shawl, and he pulled her against him. The collision was clumsy. There was no romance in it. Her heavy breasts crushed against his chest, soft and yielding beneath the thick fabric. She gasped in surprise, her mouth opening, and he brought his mouth down on hers. It was a rough, bruising kiss. Clashing teeth, the metallic taste of blood from his thumb, the sharp tang of sweat. He expected her to push him away, to slap him, to scream. Instead, Josie made a low, throaty sound that vibrated straight into his chest. Her thick arms came up, wrapping around his thick neck, her fingers digging into his unkempt hair. She didn't just endure the kiss. She devoured it. She kissed him back with the same ravenous, unapologetic appetite she had for everything else. She opened her mouth, her tongue sliding hot and wet against his tasting of coffee and salt. Hiram groaned a desperate, feral sound, backing her up until her heavy shoulders hit the rough timber of the lean-to wall. He pressed his massive frame against her, pinning her entirely consumed by the shocking, overwhelming softness of her body. Underneath the wool and the rough exterior, she was a sprawling landscape of heat and flesh. He slid his hands down, grabbing her wide hips, squeezing the thick, doughy flesh through her skirts. She hitched her breath, grinding her pelvis forward against the heavy bulge, straining against his trousers. "Hiram!" She breathed against his mouth, her voice raspy, desperate. He kissed her neck, his rough beard scraping her skin, inhaling the scent of her deeply. The isolation, the cold, the silence, it all shattered into a million pieces, replaced entirely by the loud, heavy, glorious noise of the woman in his arms. The cold in the lean-to was a physical thing, biting at Hiram's exposed skin, but he couldn't feel it. He could only feel Josie. She tasted like salt and stale coffee, her breath hot in his mouth, her hands gripping his heavy shoulders as if she were trying to climb him. He pulled back his chest, heaving his breath, pluming in the freezing air between them. Her lips were swollen, her dark eyes blown wide, reflecting the weak yellow light of the lantern. "Inside!" He rasped his voice, sounding like two rocks grinding together. He didn't carry her. She was too big, and the doorway was too narrow, and there was nothing delicate about what was happening. He grabbed her thick wrist and pulled her through the heavy plank door, kicking it shut behind them with a force that rattled the cast-iron skillets on the wall. The cabin was warmer, smelling of wood smoke, and the sharp tang of the pine pitch burning in the stove. Hiram didn't bother with the lantern. The firelight bleeding through the cracks in the stove door cast long, leaping shadows across the rough logs. He let go of her wrist and tore at the buttons of his buffalo coat, his thick, clumsy fingers fumbling. He shrugged it off, letting the heavy, stinking hide hit the floorboards with a wet thud. Josie didn't wait for him. She reached up and unpinned her shawl, letting it drop. Then her hands went to the buttons of her calico wrapper. She didn't turn around. She didn't play coy. She stripped in the flickering dark with the same aggressive, unapologetic efficiency she used to chop wood. The wrapper fell away. Beneath it she wore a simple cotton chemise worn thin at the elbows and straining across the massive, heavy swell of her breasts. Her stomach was a deep, soft curve that pushed against the fabric, her hips impossibly wide. Hiram stared. He had been a solitary creature for so long that the sheer, overwhelming reality of her flesh hit him like a physical blow. She wasn't just a woman, she was a landscape. He felt a sudden sharp spike of terror, a primal instinct that told him this woman was going to consume him. Josie saw him hesitate. She let out a short, harsh breath, a sound that was half laugh, half scoff. "What's the matter, mountain man?" She mocked, her raspy voice vibrating in the quiet cabin. "Don't know what to do with all this." The mockery snapped the spell. Hiram let out a low growl, closing the distance between them in 2 massive strides. He grabbed her by the thick meat of her hips and hoisted her up. Josie gasped, her hands instinctively grabbing his heavily scarred shoulders as he backed her into the edge of the heavy oak table. The wood groaned under the combined weight of them. He pushed the chemise up her thighs, the fabric bunching around her thick waist. Her skin was incredibly hot, radiating a feverish warmth that seeped directly into his calloused palms. He didn't bother undressing entirely. He unbuckled his heavy gun belt, letting the Colt hit the floor and tore at the buttons of his corduroy trousers. When he pushed into her, it wasn't smooth or practiced. It was a rough, blunt collision of bone and muscle. Josie threw her head back, a sharp cry, tearing from her throat, her nails digging into the hard, bunched muscle of his back. He had expected her to be passive, a heavy, unmoving thing beneath him. He was wrong. Josie wrapped her thick, heavy thighs around his hips, locking him in. She didn't just take him, she fought back. She pushed her wide pelvis up to meet every thrust, matching his brutal, desperate rhythm with her own heavy, grounding weight. Harder. She breathed her teeth, biting into the fleshy curve of his neck, her sweat slicking against his scarred skin. He dragged her off the table, their bodies clumsy, stumbling together toward the narrow bed in the corner. They hit the mattress, the rope supports, shrieking in protest. Hiram landed on his back, the breath knocked out of him. Before he could recover, Josie straddled him. She loomed over him in the dim red light of the dying fire. Her hair had come completely undone, a wild, tangled mane of dark brown hanging over her heavy shoulders. Her breasts swayed heavy and flushed the nipples hard. She looked down at him, her chest heaving, her eyes dark and feral. She took him into her hand and guided him back inside her, sinking down with a heavy, wet gasp. Hiram's hands flew to her wide hips, gripping the doughy, bruised flesh as she began to ride him. It was a grueling, sweat-soaked endurance test. The bed frame cracked ominously. The cabin smelled of sex sweat and burning pine. She rode him with a relentless, grinding rhythm, her weight pressing him deep into the mattress, forcing every ounce of breath from his lungs. She commanded the space, taking exactly what she wanted from him, stripping away his silence, his isolation, his control. When he finally broke, roaring her name into the suffocating dark, she collapsed onto his chest, a massive, crushing weight of hot, damp flesh. Hiram lay pinned beneath her, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He couldn't breathe, but for the first time in 5 years, he didn't want to. Morning arrived like a hangover. The fire had died to a bed of grey ash, and the cabin was freezing. Hiram woke first, trapped beneath a heavy woolen quilt, and the sheer, immovable bulk of Josie's leg thrown over his thighs. His body ached in ways it hadn't since he was a young man, digging in the copper mines. His back was stiff, his neck twinged, and there were deep crescent-shaped nail marks gouged into his shoulders. He carefully slid his legs out from under her, shivering as the freezing air hit his bare skin. He pulled on his trousers and his heavy wool shirt, his movements stiff and quiet. He glanced at the bed. Josie was sprawled on her stomach, her face smashed into the flat pillow, snoring with a rattling, rhythmic intensity that vibrated the cracked bed frame. In the harsh grey light filtering through the frosted window, the bruising on her thick thighs was starkly visible, purple and yellow marks from his heavy, calloused hands. Hiram looked away, a sharp, twisting sensation in his gut. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was a suffocating sense of exposure. He built the fire, the metallic clatter of the stove door loud in the small space. He wanted the silence back. He wanted the sterile, empty feeling of his own mind, the cold void where he didn't have to navigate the messy, demanding reality of another human being. When Josie finally woke, the smell of boiling coffee and frying salt pork filled the room. She sat up the quilt, falling away to reveal the heavy slump of her breasts. She didn't cover herself. She dragged a hand down her face, yawning loudly, completely unbothered by her own nakedness in the cold air. "Coffee smells burnt." she grunted, swinging her thick legs over the side of the bed. Hiram didn't look at her. He kept his eyes on the sizzling meat in the cast-iron pan. "It's how I make it. It's how you ruin it," she corrected, reaching for her calico wrapper on the floor. The tension in the cabin was a living thing, thick and combustible. The physical barrier between them had been obliterated, leaving behind a raw, jagged, emotional landscape neither knew how to navigate. They ate in silence, the only sounds the scrape of tin forks on plates and the roar of the stove. Hiram watched her out of the corner of his eye. She ate just as heavily, just as unapologetically as before, but there was a sluggishness to her movements today. She looked bruised, thoroughly used, and yet entirely defiant. After breakfast, the war resumed. Hiram retreated to the corner to mend a broken snare trap, desperate for the solitary, repetitive motion. Josie began to clean. She didn't just sweep. She attacked the floorboards with a brutal broom, shoving his boots out of the way with her foot. "You got a pile of dirty clothes in that crate that smells like a dead dog," she announced, stopping to wipe sweat from her forehead. "Leave it." Hiram growled, not looking up from the wire in his hands. "I ain't living in a pigsty. It's my cabin. And I'm your wife." She shot back, her raspy voice rising. "You paid 3 ounces of gold for me to keep this place. I'm keeping it." She marched over to the crate and began pulling out stiff, filthy wool shirts and canvas trousers. Hiram's jaw clenched. He hated her moving his things. He hated the way she forced order onto his chaos. Suddenly she stopped. She pulled a small, delicate object from the bottom of the crate. It was a woman's tortoiseshell hair comb. The teeth were missing on one side, the shell cracked. It had belonged to Mary, his first wife, the woman who had died of the milk sickness back in Missouri a decade ago. Hiram dropped the snare wire. He stood up, his massive frame suddenly filling the room, radiating a cold, terrifying violence. "Put that down," he said softly. Josie didn't flinch. She looked at the comb in her thick, fleshy hand, then looked up at him. She read the murder in his eyes, the deep, ancient grief he kept buried under layers of ice and animal fat. She didn't ask who it belonged to. She didn't apologize. She just set the comb gently on the edge of the table and turned back to the laundry. "I'll boil some water for the shirts," she said, her voice flat, devoid of its usual aggressive edge. Hiram stood there. His fists balled his heart, hammering in his chest. He wanted to yell at her. He wanted to throw her out into the snow. But she hadn't pushed. For the first time since she stepped off the stagecoach, she had recognized a boundary and stopped at the edge of it. He picked up the comb, the delicate shell feeling ridiculously small in his massive, scarred hand, and shoved it deep into his pocket. He turned and walked out the door into the biting cold, needing the freezing air just to breathe. The snow finally stopped 3 days later, leaving a world buried under 4 feet of blinding, pristine white. The sky was a hard, agonizing blue, the air so cold it felt like inhaling shattered glass. Hiram strapped on his snowshoes. He had to check the trap lines on the upper ridge. They were low on fresh meat, and the salt pork was starting to turn his stomach. But mostly he just needed to get away from the cabin. He needed space from the smell of rosewater and sweat. He needed space from the heavy, rhythmic thud of her footsteps. He needed space from the way his own body betrayed him every night, dragging him back to that narrow, groaning bed where she rode him into a mindless, exhausting oblivion. "I'll be back before dark," he told her, pulling his heavy fur hat down over his ears. Josie was kneading bread dough at the table, her thick arms dusted with flour. She didn't look up. "Bring back something that ain't deer. I'm sick of chewing on string." He grunted and walked out, pulling the door shut against the howling wind. The woods were a silent, frozen cathedral. For the first hour, the isolation was a balm. Hiram moved with the steady, rolling gait of a man born to the mountains, his massive legs pushing through the deep drifts. The cold numbed his face, freezing the moisture in his beard. But as the hours ticked on, something strange happened. The silence didn't feel peaceful anymore. It felt hollow. He found a marten frozen in a deadfall trap. He reset the heavy log, his fingers clumsy inside his thick leather mittens. He caught himself listening for the heavy, clumsy sound of Josie's boots behind him. He caught himself missing the furnace heat of her body when the wind bit through his coat. He swore out loud a harsh sound in the empty woods. She was ruining him. She was making him soft, dependent on the noise and the heat. By mid-afternoon, the sky changed. The hard blue vanished, swallowed by a bruised, dirty grey mass rolling violently over the peaks. The wind didn't just pick up, it screamed. It was a ground blizzard, a whiteout moving in fast, tearing the loose snow off the drifts and hurling it through the air like birdshot. Hiram abandoned the last 3 traps. He turned back his head down, forcing his heavy body against the gale. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in 10 minutes. It took him 2 brutal hours to reach the clearing. The cabin was a dark, square shape against the swirling vortex of white. He unlatched his snowshoes, his hands shaking from the cold, and kicked the heavy door open, stepping inside to the blessed warmth. Josie. He grunted, stomping the snow off his boots. The cabin was silent. The stove was burning low. The bread dough sat on the table, a swollen, sticky mass spilling over the edges of the bowl. Hiram pulled his fur hat off. Josie! He walked into the center of the room. The bed was empty. Her heavy wool shawl was gone from its peg by the door. Panic, cold and sharp as a butchering knife, slid right between his ribs. He spun around, his eyes scanning the room. The wood box next to the stove was entirely empty. God damn it! He breathed. He threw the door open. The wind hit him like a physical punch, blinding him with stinging white crystals. The snow was already filling in whatever tracks she might have left. Josie! He roared. The wind swallowed the sound instantly. He plunged off the porch, sinking up to his thighs in the fresh drifts. The woodpile was 30 yards from the cabin, tucked under a heavy overhang of spruce branches. In a whiteout 30 yards might as well be 3 miles. He waded through the snow, using his sheer mass to plow a trench. He couldn't see his own hands in front of his face. The cold was a physical agony, freezing his lungs with every breath. Josie. He reached the spruce trees. The woodpile was buried a smooth, white mound. He almost missed her. She was huddled on the leeward side of the logs, a massive, dark lump, half covered in drifting snow. She was clutching 3 pieces of split pine to her chest. Her head bowed, her heavy shawl plastered to her back with ice. Hiram fell to his knees beside her, plunging his bare hands into the snow to grab her shoulders. Josie! She didn't move. Her skin was terrifyingly white, her lips tinged a violent blue. Frost coated her eyelashes. He didn't try to wake her. He knocked the wood out of her stiff arms, grabbed her by the thick waist of her wrapper, and hauled her up over his shoulder. She was dead weight, 180 pounds of freezing, dense flesh. Hiram's knees buckled under the load, his boots sliding in the deep powder. He bit down on his own tongue, tasting blood, and forced himself up. The walk back to the cabin was a blurry, agonizing nightmare. His lungs burned, his thighs screamed in protest. Every step was a battle against gravity and the blinding, suffocating wind. He hit the porch hard, his knee smashing into the wood, but he didn't drop her. He kicked the door open, lunged inside, and kicked it shut, throwing the latch. The sudden quiet of the cabin was deafening. He dumped her onto the floor in front of the stove. She groaned a faint, rattling sound, her head rolling to the side. Hiram fell to his knees. His hands were numb, clumsy blocks of ice, but he tore at the frozen buttons of her dress, ripping the fabric in his desperation. He stripped the wet, heavy wool off her, revealing her pale, shivering flesh. He didn't bother with blankets. Blankets would take too long to trap heat. He stripped off his own heavy coat, his wet trousers, his frozen shirt, until he was bare to the freezing air. He hauled her heavy, shivering body up and dragged her into the narrow bed, throwing the heavy mountain lion furs over both of them. He wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her thick, fleshy back flush against his chest, locking his legs around her heavy thighs. He became a human furnace, transferring every ounce of his core heat into her freezing skin. Josie shook violently, her teeth chattering with a sound that terrified him. "Stupid, stubborn woman!" He rasped into her wet, icy hair, his voice cracking. He squeezed her tighter, burying his face in her freezing neck. "Don't you die on me! You hear me? Don't you dare go quiet on me now!" The thawing out was a brutal, ugly process. Hypothermia didn't release its grip with a gentle sigh. It fought back with violent tremors and a deep, agonizing ache as the blood finally forced its way back into half-frozen capillaries. Josie shook so hard the bed frame cracked against the log wall. Her teeth clacked together with a sickening rhythmic sharpness. Hiram didn't let go. He wrapped his massive scarred legs around her thick thighs, trapping her, forcing his chest against her broad back. He felt every spasm, every violent shudder that tore through her fleshy frame. The cabin was pitch black, save for the dull red glow of the dying stove. It smelled of wet animal fur sweat and the sharp metallic tang of fear. "Hurts!" Josie gasped. The word was barely a croak torn from a throat raw with cold. "I know." Hiram grunted, his voice a low rumble against her icy skin. "Let it hurt. Means you're not a corpse." He rubbed his large, rough hands up and down her heavy arms, ignoring the way his calluses scraped against her soft flesh. He rubbed until his own shoulders burned with the effort, desperate to generate friction to force the heat from his core into hers. Hours bled into a singular, agonizing darkness. Slowly the violent shivering subsided into a weak, exhausted trembling. The terrifying blue tint left her lips replaced by a flushed, feverish red. Her skin went from blocks of ice to an alarming, radiating heat. Josie let out a long, ragged exhale and went limp against him. Hiram stopped moving. He lay perfectly still in the stifling dark, listening. He heard the whistle of the wind tearing at the roof shingles. He heard the pop of a pitch pocket in the stove. And he heard the heavy, deep, wet sound of her breathing. He rested his bearded chin on her thick shoulder. The adrenaline that had fueled him out in the snow suddenly vanished, leaving behind a hollow, terrifying exhaustion. His hands, still wrapped around her wide waist, were trembling. He had almost lost her. The thought didn't bring the relief he would have expected a week ago. It brought a sickening lurch to his gut. He realized with a quiet, horrifying clarity that if he had found her frozen solid beneath that woodpile, the silence of the cabin would have finally killed him. He wouldn't have survived the rest of the winter. The cold would have just finished what the isolation started. "You're crushing my ribs, mountain man," Josie muttered. Her voice was weak, raspy, but the stubborn edge was there. Hiram didn't loosen his grip. "You went out for wood in a whiteout." "Stove was low." She breathed, shifting her heavy weight slightly against him, seeking the hottest parts of his body. "Bread was gonna fall." "I don't give a damn about the bread, Josie." The words tore out of him harsh and unpolished. "You don't go out in a blind blow. You let the fire die. You wrap up in the furs. You don't walk out into that." She was quiet for a long time. The heavy furs weighed them down, creating a suffocating, intimate cocoon. "Ain't used to relying on nobody," she finally said, her voice dropping the defensive armor. "Back in St. Louis, if I didn't keep the fire fed, nobody else was gonna do it. My pa drank himself to death by the time I was 12. Mother ran off. It was just me. I learned real quick that waiting on a man to do the heavy lifting just gets you frozen." Hiram swallowed hard. The harsh reality of her past settled heavily between them. He had assumed she was just loud and stubborn because she liked taking up space. He hadn't realized her loudness was a survival tactic. She took up space because if she made herself small, the world would have crushed her. "You ain't in St. Louis," Hiram said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He slid one of his massive hands up her stomach, resting his palm flat against the heavy, soft swell of her breast, feeling the strong, steady thud of her heart. "You're in my cabin. I chop the wood. You stay inside." Josie let out a breathy, exhausted chuckle that vibrated against his chest. She reached down her thick fingers, finding his large, scarred hand, and she squeezed it. "All right, Hiram," she murmured, her eyes already closing. "I'll stay inside." He held her as she fell into a deep, feverish sleep. He didn't close his eyes. He stayed awake until the grey light of dawn crept through the frosted window, standing guard over the loud, heavy-breathing woman who had just ruined his silence forever. By January, the snow was piled to the eaves of the roof. The world outside was a frozen wasteland completely inaccessible. The cabin became an island shrinking with every passing day. The truce forged in the blizzard held, but it mutated into a strange, suffocating domesticity. They moved around each other with a heavy, unspoken awareness. The war of attrition was over, replaced by a terrifying intimacy neither knew how to handle. Hiram started to pull away. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was an instinct, a feral animal retreating to the back of its cage. The sheer amount of emotional space Josie demanded terrified him. She didn't just want him to eat her food and tolerate her presence. She wanted him to be present. She talked while she cooked. She asked him about the scars on his arms. She demanded his attention just by existing in the room. He responded by building walls. He would sit for hours at the table, methodically stripping and cleaning his Winchester rifle, a task that required no conversation. He stopped looking at her when she undressed. When she climbed into the bed at night, radiating that incredible heat. He kept strictly to his side, his back rigid, staring at the logs until his eyes burned. Josie noticed. She wasn't a fool, and she wasn't delicate. She didn't cry or plead. She watched him with dark, calculating eyes, her jaw set in a hard line. The crack came on a Tuesday. The cabin stunk of rendering bear fat. Josie was boiling it down on the stove to make soap and waterproof dressing, the heavy, greasy smell clinging to everything. Hiram was pacing. The small room felt like a coffin. Every time he turned around, he bumped into a chair, or the table, or her. "You're pacing a hole in the floorboards?" Josie said, stirring the thick, bubbling fat with a wooden paddle. She didn't look at him. Her face was slick with sweat from the stove's heat. "Smells like a slaughterhouse in here." Hiram growled, stopping near the frosted window to glare out at the wall of white. "It's winter. Bear fat is what keeps your boots from rotting off your feet. You want me to stop, you can go hunt down some French perfume." She slapped the paddle against the rim of the cast-iron pot. The sharp crack made him flinch. Hiram turned on his heel. "I'm going to the lean-to." "To do what?" she challenged, finally turning to face him. Her hands went to her wide, doughy hips. "Skin a deer that's been stripped to the bone for 3 weeks, stare at the wall, hide." "I ain't hiding." He snapped his deep voice, rattling the tin plates on the shelf. "I'm getting some air that doesn't smell like rancid grease." Josie scoffed a harsh, ugly sound. She grabbed a rag, wiped her greasy hands, and threw the rag onto the table. It hit the wood with a heavy thud. "You're a coward, Hiram," she said, her voice dropping the volume, but increasing the venom. He froze. His massive shoulders tightened. He turned his head slowly, his eyes narrowing into dark, dangerous slits. "Watch your mouth." "Or what?" She took a step toward him, her sheer mass imposing, completely unafraid of his size. "You'll throw me out in the snow again. Go ahead. It'd be easier for you, wouldn't it? If I was a frozen block of ice out there, you wouldn't have to deal with me breathing your air in here." "I saved your damn life!" he roared, closing the distance between them until he was looming over her. "And you've been punishing me for it ever since," Josie yelled back, tilting her head up, refusing to give him an inch of ground. Her face was red, her chest heaving heavily beneath her faded calico dress. You pulled me out of that snow and you realized you actually gave a damn if I lived or died, and it scared the hell out of you. So now you're retreating. You're building your little ice wall again, trying to freeze me out because you think it's safer. You don't know what you're talking about. I know exactly what I'm talking about. She pushed a thick finger hard into the center of his chest. I saw that comb, Hiram, the broken one. You had a wife. She died. It broke you. And instead of acting like a man and living with it, you crawled up this mountain to rot away in the quiet. The mention of Mary felt like a bullet to the gut. Hiram grabbed her wrist, his grip punishingly tight. Don't you ever talk about her. I'll talk about whatever I damn well please. Josie hissed, her eyes blazing with a feral intensity. She didn't try to pull her arm away. She leaned in closer. She's dead, Hiram. She's a ghost. But I'm not. I'm right here. I'm loud, and I'm fat, and I take up half this damn cabin, and I'm alive. If you want a ghost, you kill me right now. If you want a wife, you look at me. The silence that followed was deafening, save for the furious howl of the wind outside. Hiram stared down at her. He saw the sweat on her brow, the furious pulse beating at the base of her thick neck, the defiant flare of her nostrils. She was a hurricane of a woman, a chaotic, messy, fleshy reality that demanded to be felt. He realized in that agonizing moment that she was entirely right. He was terrified. He was terrified of the day the winter would break, terrified that she might realize she hated this mountain, and leave terrified that he would be plunged back into a silence he now knew he couldn't survive. His grip on her wrist loosened, changing from a restraint to an anchor. He let out a ragged, broken sound, a heavy sigh that seemed to deflate the massive, rigid muscles of his chest. He didn't let go of her arm. Instead, he pulled her toward him. Josie stumbled forward, her wide chest hitting his hard ribs. She looked up, the anger in her eyes faltering, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. You take up all the air. Hiram whispered, his voice cracking. I know. She whispered back, her raspy voice catching. He brought his other hand up, tangling his thick, calloused fingers into the messy, unwashed mass of her dark hair. He didn't kiss her gently. He kissed her like a drowning man breaking the surface of the water, a desperate, bruising collision of teeth and heat. Josie let out a muffled sob against his mouth. Her thick arms came up, wrapping fiercely around his massive neck, holding him with a strength that rivaled his own. There was no retreating now. The ice wall was shattered, leaving only the burning, complicated wreckage behind. The thaw came in late April. It didn't arrive with sunshine and birdsong. It came with a brutal, deafening roar as the snowpack on the upper ridges began to give way, sending tons of wet snow crashing into the ravines. The cabin roof dripped constantly, a rhythmic plink, 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 into the tin buckets Josie had set out on the floor. The air smelled of wet earth, rotting pine needles, and the sharp metallic promise of spring. Hiram stood on the porch, his heavy boots sinking into the muddy slush. He had his sleeves rolled up, revealing the thick, corded muscles of his forearms, the cold air biting at his skin. He was smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, watching the creek at the edge of the clearing swell and rage over its banks with muddy runoff. The heavy plank door creaked open behind him. Josie stepped out. She wasn't wearing her wool shawl anymore. She had on a faded blue cotton dress that clung desperately to her heavy curves, the sleeves pushed up past her thick elbows. She carried a basket of wet laundry, her wide hips bumping against the doorframe as she maneuvered onto the porch. Creeks rising. She noted her raspy voice cutting through the sound of the rushing water. It'll crest by tomorrow. Hiram said, not turning around. He took a drag of his cigarette, the smoke curling around his scarred face. Trail to Copper Creek should be passable in a week. Muddy as hell, but passable. Josie stopped. She set the heavy laundry basket down on the wet porch boards with a solid thud. The silence stretched between them, thick and pregnant with meaning. The winter was over. The physical barrier that had trapped them together was melting away. The contract was fulfilled. She had kept the fire going. He had kept her fed. "You going to town?" Josie asked, her voice deliberately flat, devoid of its usual aggressive edge. Hiram finally turned. He leaned his broad back against the rough log railing, looking at her. The harsh sunlight illuminated the lines around her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw, the sheer, unapologetic weight of her. He didn't just tolerate her size anymore. Over the long, dark months, his body had become fiercely conditioned to it. The heavy, grounding weight of her in the narrow bed was the only thing that let him sleep. He craved the way she filled a room, the way her loud voice shattered the awful echoes of his own mind. He flicked the cigarette out into the slush. It hissed and died. "We're low on flour," he said slowly, his dark eyes fixed on hers. "Need coffee. Need more salt." Josie crossed her thick arms over her chest, a defensive posture he hadn't seen since the day she arrived. "I can pack my trunk. Won't take me long. Driver can take me back down when you load up your furs." Hiram felt a hot spike of panic quickly masked by a heavy primal possessiveness. He pushed off the railing and walked toward her. He was a giant of a man, his presence overwhelming, but Josie didn't take a step back. She held her ground just like she always did. He stopped inches from her. He reached out his massive hands wrapping around her wide, doughy waist. He pulled her flush against his hips. Josie gasped slightly, her hands automatically uncrossing to rest against the hard slabs of his chest. "You ain't packing your trunk." Hiram rumbled, his voice a deep vibration that she could feel in her bones. "I ain't a charity case, Hiram," she said, her chin tilting up, her dark eyes flashing. "Winter's over. If you're tired of me crowding your cabin, you say it now." "I'm tired of a lot of things," he said, his hand squeezing the thick flesh of her hips, pulling her tighter against his growing heat. "I'm tired of you burning the coffee. I'm tired of you using my good knife to cut salt pork." He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his breath hot against her cheek. "But I ain't tired of you." He watched the defensive armor crack and fall away from her face, revealing the desperate, fiercely alive woman beneath. "You take up the whole damn mountain, Josie," he whispered, his lips brushing against hers. "And I want you to keep it." Josie let out a wet, raspy laugh, a sound that carried over the roar of the melting snow. She threw her heavy arms around his thick neck, pulling his face down to hers. She kissed him with all the messy, heavy, unpolished truth of who they were. There was no prairie mouse, no silent ghost, no pristine romance. There was just the mud, the melting snow, the smell of wet pine, and the heavy, undeniable reality of two people who had survived the winter and each other. Hiram lifted her, her massive weight a grounding anchor in his arms, and carried her back inside the cabin. He kicked the door shut with a heavy bang, blocking out the sound of the melting world outside. The cabin wasn't silent anymore. It was filled with the loud, heavy, beautiful noise of a life being lived. Wow. If Hiram and Josie's raw, heavy, and deeply imperfect love story kept you hooked until the very end, do me a huge favor, hit that like button right now. Stories like this prove that romance isn't just about perfect people in perfect settings. It's about survival grit and choosing someone when it's hard. Make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next wild Western drama. Share this video with a friend who loves a gritty romance, and drop a comment below. Did Hiram finally get the wife he deserved? Thanks for watching.